Mike, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yep. This is so we have Mike Perrin today to talk about everything bees and beekeeping. Mike Perrin has over 45 years of beekeeping experience. He's currently our local bee inspector and has been a bee inspector for 35 years in the Kawartha Lake area. And so I think the way we'd like to start this is finding out about, I know you grew up beekeeping with your dad, and maybe going back to what that experience was like keeping bees with your dad, and at what point, I don't know if there's any specific point in time when you realized, hey, this is what I want to do with my life and stay in this industry, and what it was like back then, you know?
Yeah.
Did you fight everything against being a beekeeper, or did it come naturally and you were a beekeeper?
Well, actually it was my great-great-grandmother that actually started beekeeping. She was the beekeeper in the family. And eventually my grandfather and her husband, Minas, they took over the operation. They were running around 200 hives. So when I was growing up, as a little guy, beekeeping was all we talked about around the table. It's just something that was there all the time, and I heard it from the time I was a little boy. So I was always helping around the bee yards. I was always in the bee yards with my dad, so I picked up beekeeping very early.
Yeah.
I don't think it was necessarily something I wanted to do, or you know, it was more something I just fell into. Yeah. And as I got older, I began to enjoy actually being out amongst the bees and stuff like that. But you never seem to want to do the things that your dad does. You want to branch out and do other things. But my dad was a master beekeeper. He was quite good at it, and I picked up all my skill from there. And
100%, because at one point, I think it was over 1,500 colonies. Yeah. And what I learned in my kind of progression into commercial beekeeping was, you know, you have 10 colonies, you hit 100, there's a learning curve, things fall apart, and you figure that out, and you go to basically 1,000 colonies. And once you hit 1,000 colonies, I found it's all of a sudden you need a whole new. You can't do things the way you're doing them with 100 colonies anymore. It's a whole new learning curve again, right? That's
right. If you're in the beekeeping industry and you're just a single guy and you want to keep a bunch of bees, 300 sort of the max. Yeah. If you're young and healthy, you can do that. When you get up into 400 or 500, get into 1,000, then you're looking at hiring help and you know, getting more equipment. And when you do that, you're not doing the bees yourself anymore. Yeah. So a lot of the stuff that you're asking your help to do may get done, may not get done. So it's a little different. It's a different way of keeping bees, for sure.
So when you were keeping 1,000 colonies, were you treating, so if you went to a bee yard, were you treating, just to get through that volume of colonies, were you treating a bee yard as one unit, you know, or were you in a bee yard treating hives individually? And what I mean by that is, like, if you come in, would you know test them and treat certain ones for mites, or just they're all getting treated for mites no matter what?
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of time because
there were mites back then, maybe.
Well, there wasn't mites, but again, our operation was down near Owen Sound, Terra, and so we were up there on the weekends. So you didn't have time to clown around. We had 89 yards. Yeah. So you rolled in, you did what you had to do, and you got out. So very rarely looking at individual colonies, so to make sure they were queen rate or super them up.
Yeah, part of what I wanted to dig into is like the history and what things were like before, because there's a lot of new beekeepers. What I've noticed is when I first started, and it's happening quickly. I don't know if it's because I'm getting old, but you know, I've been going to the bee club meetings long enough, and a lot of the old timers are just not around anymore. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot of people that know what it was like keeping bees before mites and what you know, how foul brood was dealt with in the old days. So I thought we'd get into that a little bit and maybe start with honey. Mm-hmm. And because you have this wealth going right back, you know, things were a lot different 40 years ago when you were starting out to now, and maybe start with the honey crops and what those have kind of looked like over the years, and honey price, and how you can, you know, they're really tough years to make a living where I know honey went really to nothing quite a few times, right? So
well, back in the 20s and the 30s when my grandfather was just beginning, you could keep 200 colonies in a bee yard, and you could still, you know, each colony had put up 200 pounds of honey. It was a different time, and actually, you'd think honey prices would be quite low during that period of time, but after the First World War and into the Great Depression, honey was going for a pretty good price, and it was hard to get sugar. Yeah. So beekeepers were quite valued then. So you might be getting like 25 to 29 cents a pound, even in those days. So I can remember, you know, in the 80s when we were looking after our bees up in Terra, we got 39 cents a pound then, and that was in the 80s. So, you know, beekeepers did well.
Yeah.
And I know my grandfather did well enough he could buy a car, which was hardly anybody had a car in those days. So
Yeah.
it was,
Yeah, I heard that beekeepers did okay through the Depression, and it must have to do, like, there's no sugar, right? So.
True.
Yeah.
And other than, you know, foul brood, which is something you had to constantly keep a lookout for. But if you didn't lose it to that, or starvation.
Yeah. Now, what were some of the chemicals for the foul brood back in the day? And
Well,
what were they like to handle? Did you breathe a lot of that?
No. No. When I was younger and when my dad was going, sulfa was the medication of choice. And you would put that in your fall feed,
Yeah.
and it would actually medicate your bees for the whole year.
Yeah.
It was dynamite on foul brood. Now, we didn't start using that till the 60s.
Yeah.
But I think it was available during the 40s, somewhere in there. But so there was a lot of foul brood around. And I know when my dad was inspecting, that was my job.
Oh, your dad was an inspector as well?
Yeah, he was an
Okay.
inspector for 56 years, and my grandfather for 60
Oh, wow.
years. So I go along. I was the shovel guy, and
Yeah.
in those days, the inspector would just walk into a bee yard. You wouldn't contact the beekeeper,
Yeah.
and if you found foul brood, you just dug a hole, you burnt it, and buried it up. So the next time the beekeeper showed up at the yard, they'd just see a place where something had been burnt, and they know
Yeah.
the inspector had been there.
Yeah.
And it was pretty much that way until we got into, you know, the 80s. And then things changed a little bit then.
And right now, I think a lot of beekeepers don't quite get how serious foul brood can become, and how in the old bee journals, there's, you know, it's wiped out the industry at certain times in history, and we haven't seen that in generations. Is that correct? Like, there hasn't been a
Yeah.
big foul brood problem in
Well, around the
generations.
turn of the century, so my grandfather was born in 1900, and foul brood pretty much threatened to wipe out the whole industry then.
Yeah.
And that's how my grandfather got into inspecting. He started working with the old inspector in the area, and because foul brood had become so prevalent, there was a lot of travel involved. So the old man, he couldn't drive. He didn't know how to drive these newfangled cars that were around, so he hired my grandfather to drive for him. My grandfather would be maybe 17 years old.
Yeah.
And that's how he got into the inspection program,
Yeah.
is as a driver.
Yeah.
And but yeah, foul brood was a scourge.
Yeah.
And
So
until
that- Go ahead.
until sulfa come around, it was tough.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings me to what's going on today then with Oxytet, and we did everything we could to try to be able to, you know, help have it easily and readily available, and it didn't really go that way. And really, Health Canada's made it. I don't know if they've set us up in a situation where we're going to see something like that happen again because people can't get access to this, or what do you see now? Like, you know, since this whole Oxytet thing came out in the last couple of years, do you think it's going to be a problem?
Yeah, I really do. Oxytet, you know, we used terramycin for a while, and then we flipped over to Oxytet, and it was a mild antibiotic,
Yeah.
and it worked very well for foul brood. But now that it's getting so difficult to get it, a lot of the hobby beekeepers and well, even commercial guys are just throwing up their hands and saying, forget it.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't got time to be messing around. And the last couple of years, we've seen a little more foul brood each and every year. So I think it's going to become more prevalent again.
Yeah.
And it's something we're going to have to look at going on into the future.
So I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but I think it might be Alberta, or it could be, I'm not sure where. But I've heard of, for foul brood, what some beekeepers have been doing is, you know, not burning the colony, shaking the bees out, burning some frames, treating them with Oxytet, and not burning it. Like, what do you think about that practice?
Yeah, well, that just gets you into trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, down through the 80s, I think there was around 7 inspectors. I was one of them. And we went across the province and we burned thousands upon thousands and thousands of hives.
Yeah.
And it's one of those chain reaction things. You know, once you get it going, it's really hard to stop it.
Yeah.
Because most people don't know what it looks like. You know, they go into a yard in the spring and they flip up a bunch of hives that were dead out, not realizing that they died from foul brood the year before.
Yeah.
And they're seeding down the neighbors and they're seeding down everybody. So
Yeah.
it's a big problem.
Yeah, so once you get into your commercial operation and you decide you're going to try to save one colony by shaking it out, all of a sudden it's everywhere.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah.
it's carried in, the spores are carried in the honey
Yeah.
and wax and everything else. So you throw your honey supers on there, you take them off, you extract your honey.
Yeah.
You don't know where those supers came off of. So they may have been off disease colonies, and you flip them over to another yard and drop them on somebody else, and away you go.
Yeah.
So it can become a real issue. It's a bad one.
Now, the other I thought exciting thing was to get the perspective of before and after mites, because there's an awful lot of beekeepers now that don't, and I always call it the golden years before mites. But what describe what it was like keeping bees, or before and after.
Well, it wasn't as labor intensive, and timing is something that we've got to worry about now. Like, to get your medication on, you got to get your crop off early. Well, in the old days of beekeeping, I mean, you had lots of time, so you didn't necessarily need to do your extracting until you got into October, and so everything was done just a little more leisurely, and it was a fun time.
Yeah.
It was a fun time, and it was really hard for the old beekeepers to adapt to mites when they showed up.
Yeah.
And
A lot of
them
people
couldn't.
quit, yeah.
A lot of them just couldn't do it.
Yeah. A lot of guys
And,
quit.
so it took the younger generation to come on and learn how to deal with those. But
Yeah. So since we're on mites, I mean, and we're probably talking to a lot of newer beekeepers. Like what medications do you see? Because you get around to everyone hive, you just see what people are using, and you have a very kind of like me. We both get to talk to a lot of beekeepers, and we
Yeah.
see maybe get a better insight to what's working.
Well, right now,
it's not.
Apivar is kind of the number one product. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the one. And I know we got to be careful about getting resistance by overusing things.
Yeah.
That happened in the '80s with Apistan,
Yeah.
and we didn't have very much to work with, so we used that till we ran it right out.
Yeah.
And we ran into trouble in the '80s and lost a bunch of bees. But now we got quite a few more products on the market, and I think spackling those in is okay.
Yeah.
But if you really want to kill the mites, you got to be using, I think, the Apivar right now.
Yeah.
And I know in the early '80s, before we got mites in Ontario, we worked down in the States
Yeah.
with beekeepers down there that had mites already, and we picked up quite a little bit of the way they managed the mites down there,
Yeah.
which really helped us here in Ontario when we finally got here.
Yeah.
And we worked with different delivery systems for formic acid and stuff like that down in New York.
For the interesting kind of way, I was kind of curious about this is everyone that's beekeeping now would be familiar with how beetles came into Ontario. They kind of got stalled out. They haven't. I mean, I still don't see any beetles here, like in any of our hives here. I know there's some beetles showing up in Eastern Ontario now. But what's the spread been like between, if you compare mites and, so when mites first got in, you start hearing about them, was it like, okay, the mites are here and then the next day they're in everybody's hive? Or was it kind of like beetles where it was kind of like a slow progression across?
Yeah, the beetles are pretty slow progression. They're more like trachea mite was.
Mhm.
Trachea moved fairly slow. Now, the varroa was dynamite. When it took off, it was really hard to stop. But I'm not sure, there's still a lot of research going on with the beetle.
Yeah.
But I think our climate here helps
Just
us
gonna
out.
slow it down,
It's a little more backward. I
Yeah.
don't think the beetle do as well.
No.
I know down in southern Ontario, Chatham, Kent, and those areas, the beetle did quite well
Yeah.
down there. But they're a couple weeks ahead of us, and
Yeah.
their season's a little longer, and I think that's probably why.
One thing that I know for sure when I was in my earlier days of beekeeping, Tracheal mite was something, like you brought that up, and I realized, I don't ever hear many people talking about, and I know years ago there was the thing with the tech transfer teams, they couldn't find them, and they're testing around, and it sounds like, the formic acid or whatever, we really knocked them out. So do you hear much about that anymore?
Yeah,
Do
well,
you
like I
see-
say, formic acid is
Yeah.
dynamite
Yeah.
with trachea mite, and you don't need to use a lot of it.
Yeah.
And most people do use formic in some
Yeah.
way. They may use it, as a backup to their Apivar, or they may, flip-flop it from season to season. But if you're using formic acid at all, you're going to keep your trachea mite at bay.
Yeah.
But if you don't use formic for 2.5, 3 years, 4 years, And we used to run the bee lab out at Cameron, so
Yeah.
my wife still slices bees of our own, and if you don't use formic for 3 years, you're seeing trachea again.
Yeah.
To the point where there's scarring in the tracheas and things
Yeah.
like that.
So do you think that's still, do you think people are seeing you, like, maybe we better keep an eye on that because it could kind of bounce back without people noticing and cause losses, or?
Well, I think if the industry moves away from, say, using formic,
Yeah.
then that would be a problem.
Yeah.
Because the only thing I know of to kill trachea mite is formic acid.
Yeah. I wonder if the other ones like the Apulite Var or any of the time products would work on it as well, probably, maybe.
I don't know, maybe.
Because they're kind of like a vapor as well, right?
Yeah,
Or oxalic acid must kill them.
yeah.
Yeah.
See, all our research, in the 90s and late 80s was all around formic acid, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not familiar with a lot of the new applications at all yet. But
What was your biggest honey crop?
biggest honey crop?
Or a honey, harvesting story where it was just it blew your mind what the bees did?
Yeah, I think my biggest honey crop year was we had 129 pound average, which is pretty good for central Ontario. That's not too bad. In the olden days, they would have blew us away, but
Yeah.
but that was pretty good.
The best one I ever had was I moved bees to do some blueberry pollination in northern Ontario
Yeah,
and dropped them off, and then found out after that there was like a 2,000, like it was all completely surrounded by canola, like thousands of acres.
yeah,
And so they had gone up there, and then they came back down here and did buckwheat. So I had to move them twice,
yeah,
but it was a phenomenal amount of honey.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What was your worst year? Worst year beekeeping? Probably a couple of them, and you're
Yeah,
you're
there's
around
been a
that
few.
long. You have your knocks.
They usually go on kind of like a 7-year cycle where you'll have 4 pretty good years,
Yeah.
and they'll have a real dumper.
Yeah.
Like we had last year. It wasn't that good. I lost personally half of my bees.
Yeah.
So that was a tough one. But we did have a year back in, I don't know, it was 90, 93 or 94, somewhere in there. And we lost everything.
Yeah.
And it was right, we were using Apistan for varroa. And I think we just ran it too long.
Yeah.
And we were careless. We didn't keep an eye on the varroa levels.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of got caught with their pants down
Yeah.
that year.
Yeah. So how common was it, so say before varroa, to have, it's become pretty common that, we're always hearing every single year, a good year nowadays, on average Ontario, I mean, individual beekeepers of course do better or worse, but Ontario good year seems to be like 20% or something like that. Like it doesn't seem like we're already, usually,
Yeah.
like before mites, were people losing 50% very often? Like,
No, not very often.
Yeah.
So like in my grandfather's time, if he lost 2 or 3%,
yeah,
3% would be considered fairly heavy.
yeah,
And there's other people that lost more, but if you were on top of your bees and making sure that they were queen rate, and
Yeah.
making sure they were fed up, you weren't losing bees.
so it was more negligence before, now
More
it's like
negligence.
trying to scratch your head what happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you got a lot more life out of queens in those
Yeah.
days too.
Yeah.
They weren't as stressed and
So we probably didn't have the same viruses around where it's, that you just look at a hive and you can't figure out how they die sometimes, right?
no, dysentery was still a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Then if they got into late Aster or something like that, and
Yeah.
they didn't get it fanned out maybe before they got into the winter, you could have a problem there. But I think on average I'd say 2 to 3% winter losses. So that'd be through the 30s, the 50s, and 60s.
Yeah. That brings up something, because I find a lot of newer beekeepers, of course, maybe spending money on nosema medications, and so don't understand that dysentery is incredibly contagious in the colony, and what causes it. Do you want to maybe talk about dysentery and nosema? How to tell the two apart, and what to do in either case, maybe.
This is a subject
Is that a good one?
I could get in trouble for.
Uh-oh.
We used to in the lab, we checked for nosema, and we had testing that we did, and it's that's a tough one.
Uh-huh.
There are products out there that they say work, and it certainly doesn't hurt the bees to put it on.
Yeah.
But I guess I can only tell you what I do, and I've never used any products for dysentery or nosema, and I don't lose any more bees than anybody else.
Yeah.
But, you know, there may be a year that you'd be glad you put it on.
Yeah.
So
this is perfect timing because people were just asking me about this nosema and in specific in feeding sugar water, and I know that you know, I started out trying to be an organic beekeeper for quite a while, and realized, well, if I want to really grow into a commercial operation, I need to be on top of my mites and, you know, or treatment free. You know, you can't be treatment free, and that came to the, you know, conversation about sugar. Do you feed sugar or not? It seems like such an unnatural thing to do. And it was actually Phil Carr, who I hope to interview here as well. But Phil Carr said, well, you need to be feeding them sugar in the fall, and you take off all that aster and goldenrod honey, because, and the analogy he used exactly was that if, you know, how would you feel if you know, ate 20 bran muffins and then were locked up for the whole winter, right? And so, I mean, if your bees, you know, for some reason goldenrod and aster doesn't sit well with them, and it causes them to need to defecate a lot sooner than they should.
Yeah.
And if we get one of these winters where they can't fly for 4 weeks, they defecate in the hive, first thing they want to do is clean that up, and then they're just spreading it right through the whole hive. And as soon as you feed sugar water, they can hold it. They don't need to go in the hive, right?
that was the theory of the old time guys. In my
Yeah.
grandfather's time and my dad's early years,
Yeah.
your bees actually wintered better on a year where there was a lot of feeding to do.
Yeah.
So they wintered better on sugar syrup for that very reason, that they
Yeah.
weren't picking up dysentery or other things from those
Yeah.
fall flowers. So I think they fed a lot more syrup back then than even they do now.
Oh, really?
And I know just from my own experience the last probably 10 to 15 years, we've hardly had any feeding to do in the fall. You know, you touch up a few colonies and that's about it.
Yeah.
But I can remember when I was a kid, like my dad spending all fall mixing feed, mixing feed, and slapping it on.
Yeah.
And I think the bees did winter better on it.
Yeah. So then if you're a beekeeper and you go, and it's, you know, this time of year, March, and you go and you're checking your hives, you open your inner cover and it's totally covered in feces, what should you do? What, you know, should you go and see if you figure out if it was a nosema, or do you figure it was dysentery and you maybe better be taking off that goldenrod honey or aster honey?
And you're talking in the spring?
No, fall.
Or in the fall?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, you find out you're lost in March, but then, you know, what is your next course of action so you don't repeat your same mistake over again, right?
Yeah. I think it's one of those things, it's like a one-off. Like I'll have a year, like, you know, maybe every 8 or 9 years, you'll have a year where dysentery's terrible.
Yeah.
And you'll lose a bunch, and they crap down the front of the colonies, and it's a mess, and it's all over the top bars, and there's just not a whole lot you can do about it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. But it doesn't happen that often,
Yeah.
in my experience.
You ever heard of feeding bees from the bottom? That's something that seems like an old timer trick that no one does anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you were keeping single broods. They put the feeder on the bottom, and they always figured they put more feed into the brood chamber if you fed them off the bottom.
That's a trick from Phil Carr as well. He said if you're, and lots of beekeepers have done this, where you leave your box on through September because it's really nice, and you figure, okay, I'm going to pick up an extra box of goldenrod or whatever, and then, you know, the weather really changes October, it gets horrible, and you can't, you know, they can't get to their feed, even going up into the top feeder they can't. And Phil always said, you know, you put the feed underneath, what happens is that cluster actually moves down, and clusters down into the feed, and then they'll empty a feeder in one day doing that. So
yeah, I never did it myself, although I know guys that did.
I tried it. I thought it was too messy. And you know what Phil told me? He's like, these guys won't do it in this day and age because they're too lazy.
Well, the problem is nowadays you just don't have time. You got so much stuff to do, eh?
Yeah.
And like at my grandfather's day in the fall, like he was so methodical because you
didn't have to worry about mites.
Well, number one, your bees sat in one place and they stayed there. Like you didn't move them around, and because your winter losses were 2-3%. You weren't making a lot of increase all the time and moving stuff around and doing all that kind of stuff. But now, that's kind of a reality. You've got so much to do that you just don't have time to mess around with these kind of gimmicky things.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are barrel feeding.
Labor intensive,
Yeah, so it's easier to throw barrel.
What do you think about barrel feeding?
I don't like it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it is a time saver.
Yeah.
And, you know, I did a little bit of it this year because I'm keeping singles for the first time.
Yeah.
And it works well. I mean, when they rob honey, when they rob syrup in, they seem to put more in somehow than if you feed them on the top.
Yeah. I had, for barrel feeding, so we did barrel feed, and we had a good stretch there. We had a good solid 10 years of very low bee losses, and so when we were sitting down to like look at our year, we were trying to figure out why they're alive. Because we had got people that did the same thing as us, you know, their bees were dead. And so we looked at every little thing in barrel feeding. We're like, oh, what about barrel feeding? It's supposed to spread all this disease and the whole works. And I got thinking that maybe maybe it's the opposite, because you see all the dead bees left over behind there. So maybe what's happening is you're getting all the older bees that are carrying heavier loads of nosema and all that kind of thing that would normally die in the hive, getting left at the barrel feeder, and maybe there's some disease transmission there, but less than if those bees make it back into the hive. So you're kind of maybe eliminating old bees. What do you think of that idea?
I can't argue it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to lose those old field force bees anyway, so it doesn't matter if they're hairless and they're dying out around the thing. That's fine.
Yeah.
But the secret is getting that feed into the colonies that need it, and that to me is one of the problems with barrel feeding, because you'll barrel feed and then you go around the yard and you'll see 2 or 3 that just didn't get it.
Yeah.
So you'll end up, putting a high top feeder on those to spruce them up. So.
Yeah.
But
and your number one tip is to put entrance reducers on before you start feeding, right?
No. Actually, it would have been if you'd asked me that question.
Would that cause more robbing or what?
No. If you'd asked me that 30 years ago, I'd say get your entrance reducers in, but we haven't used them in 25 years.
Yeah, and you don't find the weaker ones get robbed out, or maybe that's good.
Well,
you don't have to worry about weak ones then.
If you have a weak one, like, I don't know, maybe you got a 4-frame nuke sitting in the yard in the fall or something, you want to block that one up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just leave a little spot for them. But your full-blown hives, don't even worry about it. They're fine.
What I wanted, next kind of thing was, and this is, talking about changes, the U.S. border, and I know back in the day packages came across, and a few guys that brought them. Did you guys ever deal with that or see?
Yeah, that was quite common, like when my grandfather kept bees. And I can remember as a 3-4-year-old kid in the springtime, my grandfather and my dad, they'd get packages in from somewhere in the States. And they come in early, and it was my job to go around and water all these little guys, eh?
Yeah.
And so it was a big boost to Canadian beekeepers.
Did they come from Georgia mostly, probably?
A lot of them did.
Yeah.
I think there was some from California as well that came in. But again, I was pretty young when they were doing that. But winters where you had bad winter loss or something, it was kind of a lifesaver then.
Yeah.
Because here in Ontario in those days, the winters were tougher, and you couldn't get nukes and queens early enough to get them up to strength for the honey flow.
Yeah.
So they were imperative to get them in.
So, but even back then, it was only packages, no bees on comb, correct?
No, it's just packages.
So they couldn't bring bees you couldn't bring. So how did it? By the sounds of it, back then probably there wasn't too much of a hobbyist market and a market for nukes and things like that, or was, how did it affect business here? Because right now, it's a bit of a political question, because everyone wants to, not everybody, some want to open that border and some do not, and I don't even know if I can ask you that, because...
Well, I mean, you can ask me, I probably wouldn't answer.
All right, are you in favor of having the U.S. border open to packages?
It's really going to depend on the disease situation. And we're not far enough into the beetle yet, I don't think. I'm still not sure how it's going to affect this year. Yeah. So it is a bit of a worry. I haven't got beetle myself yet. So it is a selfish concern.
Yeah. Well, Queens almost got shut down either last year or the year before.
Yeah.
Because the one importer that we're importing from, one of their bee yards was too close, or something happened where Africanized colony came in, and even Queens almost got shut down.
Yeah. I think the change here in Ontario is that a lot of these big commercial guys now are doing pollination down in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, and they're going to Quebec, and they need early bees. Yeah. So if you have a particularly bad winter and you go out there in April and your bees are devastated, how do you get your numbers to fill these contracts? So I think that's the issue. Yeah. As far as our domestic beekeepers, I don't think they care that much
Yeah.
because our own producers are supplying enough bees for,
And that's
for the
potentially
hobbies.
you're a nuke supplier.
Yeah.
And you're, a good portion of your living is made off of nukes, and
Mhm.
that could hurt that market maybe.
Yeah, some.
But they come in anyway, so I don't know. You're right. I don't think it would make a difference. I mean, we have packages coming right now.
Mhm.
Why are we bringing them from Australia when we can get them from the U.S.? Maybe is what a lot of people are
Yeah.
thinking.
And price is a factor. I mean, if you get packages from California, they're cheap. And so, money always dictates. It's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And our bees here are always a little bit more expensive.
Yeah.
But I think we're competitive.
Yeah. Speaking of pollination, I think in your operation you were saying you did some apple pollination back in the day. What I'm curious about is what the standards were like back then, like what an apple producer expected for hives. Nowadays, the standard is a box of bees, pretty well, and an empty box to move into. And I'm pretty sure back then you had to bring in triple colony.
Yeah,
to get paid.
they wanted, like back through the 60s, 70s and stuff like that, they wanted double broods.
Mhm.
They wanted good, clean rate colonies in there
Yeah.
with lots of field force. And they plunked them down every so often, but you didn't
Yeah.
get a lot of money for pollination
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
So, gathering them up and moving them out to,
Yeah.
say, Newcastle or something like that,
Yeah.
it wasn't really a paying proposition.
Yeah.
But now, when I look at what they're sending to blueberries, I still can't believe it.
Yeah.
They're just, little guys. I don't know.
I think that depends on the contract in Quebec. I know a lot of guys try to send 7 frames of bees, and the contracts stick you to 10, so you're getting a little cut on your pay there.
Yeah.
But with the whole blueberry thing, like when did that kind of take off? Like it wasn't even an industry before. Now it's what a lot of beekeepers rely on, isn't it?
Yeah. I'd say in the last 15 maybe years.
Yeah.
You know.
And before that, it was unheard of to truck your bees in New Brunswick.
Geez,
right?
no, you wouldn't be doing that at all.
Yeah.
So it was, mostly here in Ontario, pollination would be apples or it would be pumpkins.
Yeah. And so who started off that whole thing taking over? Is that like maybe Parker's started doing that? Who was the first one, or do you know?
Well,
It's grown into quite an industry now, right?
yeah, it would be Southern Ontario guys that would have started, but we got a few in the north here now
Yeah.
that are doing it. More and more people all the time. But, it's a tough way to earn a living too.
Yeah.
Well, you've done
Oh,
it
yeah,
yourself,
yeah.
so
There's no sleep, that's for
there's
sure.
no sleep.
No sleep. So, like, you inspect a lot of hives now for pollination. Is anyone that's doing the apple pollen, like, is there still people renting bees out that are full double colonies that or is that still expected by anybody, or is it all kind of gone standardized where it's a box of bees? And
Yeah.
I can't imagine how you would prevent the swarming when you're sending 2 boxes, and you'd have to have like another 2 boxes on top.
I know some guys here in our area that are taking doubles.
Yeah.
Like good strong colonies to apples here in Newcastle and
Yeah.
up along the lake. And when they bring them back, then they split them
Yeah.
all ways, and then they go to blueberries.
Yeah.
So yeah, they still want good hives of bees.
Yeah. Now for blueberries, I mean, one of your big things in the spring will be like my bees when you will come out and inspect them all to be able to go to blueberries. When you inspect those, and are you ever involved on the return trip, and you see what the condition of them are when they return? So in my case, I felt like my bees came back in good shape, and sometimes with surplus honey, even. But they were going with some of the, they were in the right place, right? So
Yeah. Now we just inspect them going out.
yeah,
I'm not sure. Well, we just don't have the resources to look at them coming back.
Yeah.
But I have seen the bees coming back
yeah,
in a lot of cases, and sometimes they're not that great a shape, and other times they come back pretty good.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends down there, what kind of weather they're getting.
yeah. Yeah, I found our success on how they looked when they got back, all depended on how well we did, having them queen right before they left, and if you're trying to, make up splits, a week before, the closer it got to shipment date and you're still making splits, the more you wouldn't have good bees coming back, so.
Well, I think that's maybe the reason for the losses coming back is because you're just not you're not taking the time, you're jamming, you know, you buy a bunch of queens, you jam them in,
Yeah.
and off they go.
Yeah.
So you're not around to make sure they take,
Yeah.
or things like that. So you're losing colonies just because you're in a hurry,
Yeah.
and you're not taking the time. But
Yeah. So for your own, with queens and jamming, speaking of jamming queens in, for your own operation, if you're going to be expanding, what do you do for queens? Do you, like a lot of, you know, to this day there's commercial beekeepers that just, you know, speed split, they're done with it? Or like, what's your technique? Do you do a little bit more complicated than that? Or?
no, actually, I'm really not complicated at all.
Yeah.
So much so I feel like doing a YouTube video, because you watch them making these walk-away splits and you're like, oh my God,
Yeah.
that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But if I go into a yard, I've wintered well, double brood chamber colonies, you give them a little crack.
Yeah.
If they're like strong on the bottom and strong on the top, you just crack the top one off, set it on a floor.
Yeah.
You equalize them. It doesn't matter where the queen is.
Yeah.
And you just make sure you have eggs both sides.
Yeah.
And then you take the split and you throw it on the truck and you take it to another yard.
Yeah.
So in 21 days, or of course a little bit longer than that.
Do you ever leave them in the same yard and just roll the dice?
No, I move them. So the field force that's out in the field when you're splitting goes back to the bottom box,
Yeah.
which is always just a little bit weaker than the top one.
Yeah.
They don't have as much honey or as much pollen, but they have the field force.
Yeah.
So the piece of the split that has the queen, you just fire a super on it when you find out she's there.
Yeah.
And the one that hasn't got a queen, they're not far behind.
Yeah.
They're not that far behind.
Especially if you catch it in the perfect
Yeah.
timing.
Now if you go out, yeah, so I don't buy queens, but if you go out in the spring and your colonies haven't done that well,
Yeah.
you know, you got maybe a full box of bees and maybe got 2 down below. So I build nukes, and I usually build 4-frame nukes.
Yeah.
And you'll just take out a few combs from each hive.
Yeah.
Build a bunch of 4-framers and set them aside, and
Yeah.
build your increase that
So
way.
in your operation was the main kind of income stream, was it honey production then?
Yeah, honey
Okay.
production
And
and
then you sell
nukes.
some nukes on the side, and,
Yeah.
but mostly honey.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you feel about the honey prices now?
Well,
So right now, what
yeah.
we're kind of seeing is that wholesale honey, like bulk, you know, is anywhere from, I'm just going to give it a wide range because it really is kind of crazy where we see it going right now, anywhere from $3 to up to like $3.80. So anywhere in there is where we've been seeing it go for the last while. Is
Yeah.
that sustainable?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it probably is. I mean, I can remember back in the 80s, we dreamed of a day we could get $1,000 for a 600-pound barrel. It was like our wildest dream, and then just went right on by it like it was standing still. So.
Yeah.
But no, the prices are good, and you know, there's money to be made in the industry still. It's hard work,
Yeah.
and but there's still money to be made.
Okay. Yeah, honey production for me, I went right into nukes and making queens, and it was always a goal to see how little honey we could make.
Yeah.
And I think the most drums, we were running about 1,200 colonies, and the most honey we ever did was about 60 drums.
Yeah.
And a lot of years I was able to neck it right down to like, 10 drums of honey off it, because we just split them so hard, right?
Yeah.
Because we're more into, making bees than honey. But when I do bee talks at, say, Rotary clubs and things like that, I explain to people, like, in bees, it's not just the honey. There's a lot of different avenues you can take. So you could be doing pollination as your main source, right? And as soon as you decide to do pollination, or as soon as you decide to do livestock into the business, you sacrifice all your honey, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, my grandfather and my dad used to say that they weren't beekeepers, the bees kept them. And it was really true. They had no overhead. They didn't spend a lot of money. Like, they made do with what they had.
yeah.
And everything that come off those bees was pretty well profit. So, raise a family or do those types of things, that was necessary.
Yeah.
You didn't want to go out and, change your frames every year,
Yeah.
or buy new boxes or paint everything
Yeah.
just to make it look nice.
Yeah.
Some of the yards looked rough, but they made a lot of money.
Yeah, and part of that would be like what I'm curious about is like what your take is on the health of the industry. So for me, when we started, the beekeeping and then selling all the equipment side of the business, in the beginning I was always like, okay, well, it seems like beekeeping and that whole business equipment side is going up, right? And then part of that was because beekeeping was in the news with all the bee losses, and there was a lot of interest in the news. And I thought, well, this will be kind of like disco in the 70s, where it's like this, and then it just goes like this.
I was going to say,
So-
the industry's kind of bipolar.
Yeah.
Either you're really down
Yeah.
or you're really up. And like last year I was really down.
Yeah.
And this year I go out to the bee yards and it looks right.
Yeah.
And that's what shocks me every year, is you can have just a devastating year, and then the next year, right, you got your numbers back and you got a nice crop on, and things are going well.
Yeah.
But back in the 50s, 60s, or even back in the 30s, everything was kind of just hummed along, and you didn't worry about the ups and downs too much.
I guess what I'm getting at here is like trying to figure out like what did hobbyist beekeeping look like in the 50s and 60s compared to what it is now, and I mean how many, like in the health of the industry, what I mean is there a younger generation picking up to be beekeepers? Seems like a lot of interest, but is any of that translating into doing it for a living, which is what keeps the industry alive?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of hobby beekeepers back early.
Like backyard beekeepers?
No, because they were usually foreign people from Eastern Europe or immigrants that had come in that had beekeeping in their backgrounds, and it was a part of what they did. So they would have
like
20 colonies or 30 colonies, chickens and a cow and all that. So it was just a part of what they did. It wasn't a hobby.
Yeah.
And but now, I mean, and this is a good thing, that these hobbyists are kicking up. They want a garden hive here. They just want to help out the industry, or they want to pollinate some of the fruit trees in a city or whatever they're at. And it's good and bad at the same time, because it's hard to get these people on the same page and educated with all the new treatments and things you got to do to keep these bees healthy. So for commercial guys, sometimes you get a few hobbyists around you, it can be a bit of a nightmare. Yeah. But at the same time, these are the people that are buying your products, so they're buying the nukes and they're buying equipment like you have here.
Yeah.
So
because you're on the leading edge of it, and I mean, you saw me when I was quite a smaller beekeeper, and and became commercial. In your 35 years as a bee inspector, in this point in time right now, does it look like we have a good roster of beekeepers that are start going commercial? Like, is it at a high point in the career? Probably is, I bet.
That's a hard question. Like I talk a lot to the commercial guys, and they're frustrated. Yeah. There's a lot of problems, a lot of issues.
I've seen a lot of commercial in the last couple of years. Quite a few guys just retire.
Yeah, it's just it's got, because of the numbers, these commercial guys may have 3, 4, 5,000 colonies of bees, and the overhead is immense, and your gas and all the different things, hiring help, and the price of equipment and all those things are a real burden now.
I think the labor has been probably the biggest in our operations. 100% been. The reason our operation is reduced is I can't find labor.
That's right. It's really.
And I wasn't willing to bring in. I didn't want to bring in foreign help. Like, it basically seems nowadays, if you want to have in one of these operations like 3, 4, 5,000 colonies, that's your option. You have to set up housing and bring in help, because there's no one around that wants to do it. Yeah. The labor part of it, right?
But the hobby part of beekeeping now has really exploded.
Yeah.
There's more hobbyists than I've ever seen before. And oddly enough...
How many do you think are registered?
Maybe half.
Half?
Maybe half. See, back in my great-grandfather's time was my grandmother. She was a school teacher, and she kept 200 hives of bees. It wasn't unheard of to see women keeping bees in those days. Yeah. But they kind of got away from it as they got into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and now probably 60 to 70% of new beekeepers are women. Yeah. And they make great beekeepers. They're gentle. They're observant. So it's an interesting demographic that's changed, and we'll see how things go in the long run. But most of the people I go see now are.
That's good advice for me, because I should know who my customers are.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I was trying to touch there, like on what the future kind of looks like, and to me it feels like we have a good base of it's in good shape right now. If we can keep the bees alive, is what it comes down to. So.
Yeah, I think. We have the knowledge, we have the know-how, we have the people out there that can keep this industry going. And so I think there is a bright future for beekeeping, but the times are tough right now. And so we'll see how people kind of roll through these next couple of years. But
yeah. Any advice? I see sometimes through our thing here, like when people ask about, being registered as a beekeeper, the first fear is, expense. I'm like, no, it's free. And then you're going to hate me for this, but then I said it's free, and you just call up the bee inspector anytime you want. Should I keep telling people that?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. No, it's the bee inspection program is still a free service.
Yeah.
And so it's valuable.
Yeah.
And I'm getting more and more now with modern technology and cell phones and computers. I spend a lot of time just sitting in a chair at home answering questions and things like that. So that's sort of new to me. But you can send pictures. You got a problem in your beehive, you send me a shot of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you can work it out, just with a phone call.
Yeah.
So
now, is it quite often still where you get called out and you look at a hive and like for me, I look at a hive and it's like, oh, that's one of the ones that keeps you always scratching your head as a beekeeper. I guess you probably have that a lot where people are trying to get you to diagnose, the fallout from their dead hives and how difficult is that? And we can't give a person an answer why their bees are dead.
It's really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of times, we'll go out to a call and if it isn't anything too serious, we don't try to give too much input.
Yeah.
A lot of beekeepers, they're usually pretty good at researching what they want to do.
Yeah.
And they're really attached to their idea of beekeeping.
Yeah.
And you don't want to discourage them because some of these new ideas and stuff may be things that we'll be using in the future. But it is slightly frustrating to me, some of the techniques that they're using, and one of the things that really bothers me is nucleus.
Yeah.
When people are building nucleus and I'm going out and having a look at them, like they call it a 4-frame nuke, and you look in, there might be 2 frames of bees and an empty comb, and they're weak.
Yeah.
And they wonder why they're not growing.
Yeah.
And so they're making them too early in the year.
Yeah.
So they're just kind of hanging fire until you get into the right season, and that drives me insane.
Yeah, making weak bees there's no point.
Well, it's like growing a garden. If you've ever grown tomatoes, if you stuff them in too early, they're just going to sit there.
Yeah.
And then once you get into the 24th of May, off they go.
Yeah.
And it's the same with bees. You really need to get into that.
That's
that good
100%. So like in our new production, what I found was we always wanted to get an early start just because to get through the amount of work. So like we had to start early because if we tried to start later, if it rained for a couple of days or anything happened wrong, we just couldn't get the work done. So we would start early, and what it would look like is every year we'd have queens around April 20th, which is on some years that's fantastic. Other years it's awful, right? And you end up having to bank the queens. But always about that date, if we would keep about 30 colonies in a bee yard.
Yeah.
If you go in, out of those 30, hopefully there'd be about 5 that are ready in April. And then by the time you get back, you get into the first week of May, then it's full speed ahead.
That's right.
So
And you may want to cut this out, but because I make my own nukes at home, so
Yeah.
I'm starting from scratch. I'm starting from an egg.
Yeah.
But I usually don't start building any increase until the bees are just popping.
Yeah.
So usually around 20th of 20th of May.
Yeah.
And there might even be cells hanging at times.
Yeah.
But that being said, when I build those, they just take right off, and they'll be as good as the nucleus that's built in April with say a bottom queen.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
They'll get there
because
at the same time.
they get there at the same time. It's just you wouldn't have time to make that one.
That's
in
right.
April. That's to make that one.
That's
in
right.
April. That's what the problem
That's
is.
the thing.
Yeah.
But-
So, well, I think we covered a lot there. I really appreciate you.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation.
Oh.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks
you.
for having me down.